All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me. So first off, I'd like to start by asking how many of you are working with user stories today? How's that going? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Are you somewhere in between, depending on the day of the week or the sprint you happen to be in? Lots of fun stuff, writing user stories or working with user stories. Do any of you struggle to ensure that your team has a shared understanding of the stories? Are you halfway through a sprint and realize right when you start, everyone's aligned, we all have the same understanding? Halfway through, you realize 4 or 5 different people, maybe including the customer or the product owner, maybe there's a little bit of misalignment or misunderstanding between the different folks on the team. Right? Are there any of you that struggle sometimes to get to done in a particular iteration or even a release and are willing to actually admit it? Okay, so it's a lot more common than we realize or that we care to admit that it actually is. My name is Michelina, as I said. I'm a senior associate with EBG. I have been with the organization, I'd say, for just about a year now. I've spent about a third of my career on the business side, 2/3 in IT. I've worked with and on agile teams in a variety of roles. My area of focus is enterprise change, product discovery, and agile business analysis. At EBG, our main focus is around the agile product discovery space. On the screen, you'll see a sampling of our clients. Everything that we're going to talk about today are things that we have used across a number of different domains. So there are a variety of domains represented here. I'd like to just check. There's only so much space I have to move around. For those of you on this side, am I right in the way of the screen? Because if I am, I'll just shift over and maybe not move around. OK, so just let me know as I'm going if I'm getting in your way. As I mentioned right at the beginning, we will have a giveaway at the end of the session. If you are interested in the draw and interested in the books, this is what we're going to be giving away. Please feel free to put your names on the yellow sign-up sheets on your desks or on the tables. All right, so let's get started. Ready and done. Right? Most of you, how many of you are familiar with these terms? At a minimum, most of you should be familiar with done. How many folks are familiar with done? Good. How many folks are familiar with the word ready? A couple of you, good. Of those who are familiar with ready, if you can just keep your hands up. Of those of you, how many of your teams actually have a definition of ready that you use on a regular basis? Okay. So done is a lot more common with, I would say, most teams, most agile teams. Ready, not necessarily a newer concept, but maybe a little bit harder to sort of wrap our hands around, our arms around. And what we're really going to be talking about today is, well, first of all, what's the big deal about being ready, and how does that help us to get done? Is it even relevant? Does it even matter? So let's see if it's a big deal. First off, I'd like to start by talking about indicators where you potentially have an issue with your stories not being ready. So if you are experiencing traveling stories, that's an indicator that your stories aren't ready when you're starting an iteration or even planning for a particular release. For those of you who may not know, a traveling story is a story that moves from iteration to iteration, sprint to sprint, potentially even from a release to a release. Sometimes they're called carryover stories. Okay? So if you are finding you're experiencing this, that means it is an indicator your stories aren't ready. About a third of the clients that we work with at EBG, we find it's pretty common, and people don't even realize that that's what's happening. So they're not getting to done, and they're a little bit confused as to why, and part of it is because their stories are traveling. Okay. Stories that are in a ready state, so they're understood, there's a shared understanding about what those stories are, what they mean. Those are typically easier to estimate and plan for. So if you are having issues within your team where there's poor estimation or maybe inconsistent estimation and planning, or maybe even inefficient planning, it might be an indicator that your stories aren't ready. And the third part, or the third indicator, is if you're building the wrong product. So if your teams are building the wrong product, first of all, they're not done. So they might have finished whatever it is that they've put in the particular sprint, iteration, or release, but they haven't built the right product for whatever reason. Now, there are many reasons why you may not have gotten to done. You might have built the wrong product. But one of the indicators is that the stories weren't ready to begin with. Right? Typically, if you build the wrong product, it's we maybe didn't have the best understanding to begin with, and therefore whatever we've assigned to or put into the sprint or iteration or even a release was unclear, and therefore the stories were not ready. So in today's session, we are going to talk about how you get your user stories ready. Now, a couple of just some general information before we do a deep dive. Everyone knows that the goal of Agile is really to deliver high-value products. So deliver high-value products as quickly as possible with a bias towards the shortest time frame. Okay? It doesn't matter if you're building a product, working on a service, working on a very complex system. Regardless, whatever it is that you happen to be working on, the goal is high value and as quickly as possible. Okay? And one of the ways, or one of the things that we typically do as teams, or as Agile teams, is we discover and we deliver. So we do some discovery work, we figure out what it is that we want to build, what is it that our customers want, what is the product owner thinking through. We build, we deliver a product, we get some feedback, and that informs our next discover and deliver cycle. So what does this sort of mean? Well, we purposely use an infinity symbol here. Because you discover, you deliver, you learn a little bit more, you're discovering, and you're going to deliver into the next cycle. And it becomes a regular cadence within the teams. Okay? Discover and deliver. So discover is the work that we do to explore, evaluate, and confirm our understanding of the product. And deliver is taking that understanding and actually building something, testing it, releasing it, validating, getting feedback, and using that feedback to inform our next discover and deliver cycle. Okay, so it becomes sort of this regular cadence. We discover some more, and we deliver again. Now, how does this map up to our product backlog? So just bear with me. I'm going to quickly go through these slides, and then we're actually going to work on a real example. So when we discover, we have a number of ideas. We come up with big product chunks, so big pieces of the product that we want to deliver, and we add them to our backlog. As time goes on, we refine, we break these bigger chunks into smaller chunks, and eventually we get to what I would call product bite-sized chunks, or manageable, something that would be manageable, and we can get to write stories that are in a ready state, and that ready state allows us to deliver a done product. And preferably, the done product is the right product at the right time for the right customer. So let's link this to what do we mean by ready. Okay. So there are different types of being ready. One is to be ready for planning. Ready for planning, you could be ready for planning when it comes to your release, or ready for planning when it comes to an iteration or a sprint. Okay. From there, we're ready for development. We get ready for development. We build what we need to do, and this brings us to a done state, okay? Or a done product chunk. Now, the way that we do that, or the way that we get ready, or ready our user stories, which is really what the bulk of our discussion is going to be from here on out, is we want to understand our product holistically. So we want to understand it across what we call the 7 product dimensions. So I'm going to walk you through what these 7 product dimensions are. You don't have to worry too much about writing furiously. There are definitions later on in the presentation, and we will make that available to you. Okay? So let's start off with the user. So user is the people, the systems, the devices that interact with the product. Interface, so how the users connect to the product. Action, so the capabilities, the activities that the product offers to its users. Data, the information or the data that the product needs to store or retain. Control, the business rules, the business policies, the regulations that the product needs to enforce. Environment, so the physical properties and technology platforms that the product needs to conform to. Quality attribute, last but not least. So quality attributes are about the properties that describe both the environment in which the properties that describe the operations and the development that the product is needed. Okay? So I want you to think of these as things like security, scalability, availability, performance. So all the little things that sometimes we forget to talk about before we get our stories ready, and then halfway through we have all these questions that come up from our development teams. Okay. Now for those of you who have a traditional requirements engineering background, these dimensions would map to functional and non-functional requirements or areas. Okay? But I don't want you to get too fussed that this is about waterfall. I want to reinforce. We're looking at a structured way that you can get your stories ready. Okay? And these are the dimensions that are going to help us get the stories ready. We just try to map them for people who are transitioning into Agile. Sometimes this is an easier way to make that transition. So what's the big deal about these dimensions? Well, we use these dimensions to get a shared understanding, or to understand the stories holistically and to actually get them ready. Okay? I want you to think of them as these are the different pieces that you can assemble, and they represent the story. Okay? So think of if you have a bunch of threads, you're pulling out the most important threads and you are assembling the story. Okay? And one of the ways that you can do that is by using the dimensions. There are many other ways, but in terms of what we're going to be talking about today, it's about the 7 dimensions and a structured conversation. So we talk in our teams, we have lots and lots of conversations, what needs to go in the product backlog, who are our users, what do we need to do, et cetera, which is very, very good, right? So one of the best things about Agile is we're having those conversations in a meaningful way. What would be even better is if that conversation is a little bit more structured. So for those of you who like a little bit of structure, so some boundaries in terms of, well, how do we figure out, do we have the right level of information? Are the user stories ready? Are they going to be interpreted in the same way, depending on who I'm speaking with? We use what's called a structured conversation. And the structured conversation, I'm going to quickly walk through that. At the far left-hand corner there is think of that as a product chunk. So we have this product chunk, and we're together as a team or as a group with our customers, the technology partners, our business partners, et cetera, and we explore that product chunk. And we have a number of different conversations, and we talk about the users and perhaps maybe the data, maybe some business rules that the product needs to enforce. So when we talk about a number of different things, and so we start getting, I wouldn't say a laundry list, but we start getting a list of things that might be important at some point. Okay? But we can't have everything in the next cycle. We need to figure out, well, which ones of these are going to be the most important things. So the next thing we do is we explore, or once we've explored, we evaluate these different pieces, and we use value as a way to determine which subset of these wonderful things that we just talked about that we need to work on next, in our next cycle. And we use value as a filtering mechanism, so think of that as a way to slice. And it's a filtering mechanism to help us identify a subset of what we originally explored. And these would be sort of the high value items that we need to focus on for the next cycle. And then the third component of that is that we want to confirm. And what we're confirming is that we have a shared understanding, so that when we finally do start the sprint, or at least early on in the sprint, or the iteration, or even the release, that we have a common understanding, and that understanding is from a holistic view. We're not really missing key pieces that we're going to need to worry about later on, or halfway through an iteration we realize, hey, we forgot to ask about the data or about the business rules and what platforms are we going to use and these types of things. So the structured conversation, I want you to think of this, though, as ongoing. So it's not linear. You're exploring, you're evaluating, you're confirming, and it's this ongoing things that you do as part of the discovery. So we're discovering, we're looking at our stories, et cetera. You can use this approach regardless of what planning horizon you're working with. So whether that's sort of what we call the now view. So the now view, think of your sprints or your iterations maybe a week to 2 weeks. You can do it in your preview, which is sort of at the release level. So that might be a monthly, every 2 months, quarterly, depending on what your release looks like. Or you can do sort of look at it in your big view, which would be more your roadmaps, which would be 12 to 24 months. Okay? And at the core, right, we have the explore, evaluate, and confirm to get to a shared understanding. And we use these 7 different product dimensions to get to that understanding. Okay? And to help us not understand, in this case, the stories in a more holistic way. So up on the board here, I have a photo of a team that's actually up at the wall. It's an agile team. It consists of people from the business partners. There's the product owner. We have the technology folks in there, as well as representation of customers. And they're up at the board. They're working up on the wall. We call this the options board. Okay? And across the top are the different product dimensions that we just talked about. And as they're conversing, or as they are discussing their stories, their release plan, et cetera, the big chunks, and trying to get them into smaller chunks, They're using the 7 product dimensions, as well as, again, exploring, evaluating, and confirming. And one of the things that you will notice here is that this is not a spectator sport. Everybody's up, everybody's at the wall. We're not around a table all kind of writing furiously a bunch of different user stories. This is really about explore, evaluate, identify our high-value options, confirm our understanding, and then move on to planning. The other thing you will notice about this is you cannot tell who's the product owner, who's the customer, who are the technical folks. Okay? That's because everybody's engaged. And you will notice this one woman here, her finger's pointing. So they're working at some of the initial, I think she was working on the user and the interface dimension. As a result of those discussions, she remembered something that she didn't want to forget, and she moved down the wall. Right? So again, this options board sometimes is called the discovery wall, and added some additional information into another dimension. So it's this idea of going back and forth, so across the dimensions and then within the dimensions as information surfaces. Okay? Here's an example of another team's options board, so again, across the top. And again, this is like maybe an hour and a half's worth of work. And by the end of this, they've identified what's going in their release, what's going into their sprints, and the actual stories for the next coming sprint are completely in ready state. And I will show you how to use the structure conversation and the 7 dimensions on a real-life example. Okay, let me just do a time check, because I know we start a little bit later. So the example we're going to use is Concerts for Me. So Concerts for Me is a website and an application that allows musicians and artists to connect with their fans, their audience. It includes, where they're going to be, when they're going to be, where their concerts are, if they're doing impromptu sessions at a club somewhere, and vice versa. The fans can connect with the artists. And one of the things, our newest initiative, is we're going to partner with restaurants, local restaurants in the area, who will offer discounts to our members who happen to be going to a concert. Okay? So if you're going to a concert, there are going to be restaurants in the area, so we want to offer you discounts where you can stop off, have dinner, and then off you go to the concert. Okay? So we're actually going to take a standard story, the way that we would normally approach a type of initiative, and we're going to walk it through the structured conversation, including the 7 dimensions. So up on the board here, we have an example, pretty standard. Sorry, did you have a question? Okay. As a concert goer, I want to use dining discounts so I can enhance my concert experience. Okay, kind of intuitive. Not too bad, right? What do you think? Is it ready? Is it in a good state? Think so? Good. How would we, are we able to estimate it? We have enough information to provide an accurate estimate, you think, or relatively accurate? Okay. How about developing it? Do we have a good sense of what we would need to develop? No? Good, okay. What are some of the questions we would have to ask to get comfortable with estimating it, planning it, or even developing it, or even testing it, quite frankly? Any thoughts? But it's not a trick question. Anything normally, if you would see this story, what are some of the things that would come to mind in terms of what you would have to ask, what additional information you would need?
Actual discount details. How do you want to spread out your discounts?
How do you want it delivered?
Good. How do you want it delivered? Good. What else? Anything else? What other thoughts come to mind? What are the discounts? Good. Which restaurants? Good. Excellent. Okay. So it's not quite ready, right? There's some additional work that we need to do, and depending on the answers to these questions, we might get tighter on the story being ready, or maybe will lead to other questions. So let's have a look at how we would use the 7 product dimensions to make that particular story ready. So this is an options board. So remember that image that I saw you of the agile team? Pretend this is up on a wall. We're just going to use this as reference, so it's easier to do a summary when we go through each dimension. Okay? Now, the one thing I want to point out, it starts with user, ends with quality attribute. You don't have to go in this order. This is just the way that we've laid it out. The key is for, as a team, and depending on what you happen to be working on and what your goal is for the next iteration or releases, you pick and choose the order that's relevant, and you just basically go back and forth. And if some questions lead to, for example, well, what discounts? What's the information? What's the data? You don't have to wait till you get to data. You can just jump to it. If it's up on a board, you start adding that information. Okay? So we're going to start with a user. So remember, a user interacts with the product. And so for the Concerts for Me members, there are a number of different users that use our product. Okay? In this image here, we actually have these different users identified as personas. You'll notice we have everything from superfan through to soloist to dedicated, et cetera. So based on some research, some market research that the product owner does, some analysis around where do we want to focus our attention, the product owner decides, you know what, for our next cycle, and let's pretend this is release number 1, we want to focus on our superfans. Okay? So they star it. They add it to the options board. So again, pretend we're up on a board. We've listed all the users we've identified so far. And the product owner said, we want superfan to be the one where we focus. So think of that as high value. And we put a star next to that so we don't forget that that's where we need to be focusing our attention right now. Okay. So we move on to action. So action is about the capabilities, the activities that the product provides to the users. There are a lot of different ways that you can actually visualize the action dimension. You don't have to use visual models. We have found that it's much more effective to use models or any type of visualization of the dimension to make it easier to get people to a shared understanding. We've used here a process flow. You can use a story map, whatever makes sense. Okay? And there's a number of different techniques. We're just going to cover the basics here. So in this case here, the team gets together and they identify 6 action options. So 6 possibilities or 6 things that we can work on potentially out of this domain. Now remember, the product owner already said we want to focus on the superfans. And remember, what is the goal of the initiative? Dining discounts. What about the dining discounts? We want to give them to our members, right? Okay. So I'll give you a moment to read that. Now, I should mention, you notice this is lightweight, low fidelity, right? I don't have a Visio flow here. I'm not saying you go out and go crazy. It's basically 6 Post-it notes. It's very low fidelity, lightweight, and it's just a way of helping the team visualize, okay? So based on our original goal for our next cycle, our product owner decides, you know what, the most important things out of all of these are search and download, because we want them to use the discount coupon. Yes, these are wonderful things that maybe we want to explore later, but we don't want people to get sidetracked. Okay? So we're going to focus on searching for the discount and downloading it. We add it to our option boards, and we always put a star next to high value, okay? Which are moving us forward. So it helps the team ensure that we're focused on the high value options, or that we've deemed to be high value as of now. The next dimension is the data dimension. So data, this is really about the information that the product stores, retains. You need a repository of information. Now, I don't want to scare anyone. This is a data model. Some of you may be familiar with data models. Some of you may actually hate data models. This is just a technique to visualize the data. And again, lightweight. This is a conceptual entity relationship diagram. How many people, by the way, are familiar with data models? A couple of you? OK. You notice how this really isn't that difficult to understand, or like we're not doing a deep dive. We're not talking about the physical models that the data architects want to put together. Lightweight. What information do we need to help us move forward? Because we don't want to miss the data component, because at the very end, we might be finished our iteration and want to release, and we have no way of tying the information together. So based on some discussion, based on those key actions, we want to be able to search for discount and download it. These are the data pieces that we need to be concerned with at a high level. And the other thing I should mention, some of the stuff already exists. We're not building it from scratch. Okay? We already know where the concerts are, where the venues are, but we're going to need it in order to search for the restaurants and make the link between the restaurants and which venue or concert we happen to be attending. Okay? But again, lightweight, Post-it notes in this case. We drew a bunch of lines and identified the relationship. Nothing overly complicated. And I'll point you to some resources. There are other techniques you can use in this. If you don't like ERDs, don't get too fussed about it. The key is just making sure you have something to visualize or make it easier to get everybody on the same page. So we add those to our option board and move on to control. Remember, control is about enforcing constraints. Right? And when you think of constraints here, I want you to think of business policies, business rules, regulations. So things that the product needs to enforce. So the product owner and the team, they identify a number of different business policies. And remember our 2 key things, search and download. So I want to just give you a couple seconds just to read these. I'll give you a moment there, and once you're comfortable with that, I want you to shout out. Can everyone see it, or should I read it? Should I read them off? Is it a little bit tough for the folks? The folks at the back are a bit struggling. Okay, I'll read them off. Anyone can search for Concert for Me partner restaurants. Only Concert for Me members can search for dining discounts. Concerts for Me is not responsible for reinforcing the terms of the dining discounts. Only active dining discounts can be searched. And only members can download a dining discount coupon. So based on the information we have so far, search and download, which are high-value actions, and a couple of other things that we've talked about so far, are starred. Which ones of these business policies do you think we should star as high value, that we need to maybe take into consideration of getting our user story ready? Which would be the most important ones? The last one, so only members can download a dining discount. Good. What else? The other two onlys, right? Only members can search, and only active dining discounts can be searched. Excellent. So those are the three that the team identifies with the product owner. These are high value. We add them to our options board. Okay. So I'm going to pause here. So remember this wonderful story here? We said, hey, not quite ready. We need some more details to get a better understanding, or better shared or holistic view. So we're going to pause here. We've gone through 4 dimensions. Now, I recognize we've gone through them quite quickly. But we've gone through 4 dimensions. The 4 that we have gone through are the ones that sort of fall under the functional bucket. Okay? And what we're going to do is we are going to assemble the story, the user story, based on the information we have so far. Okay? So again, we came up with, in each one of these dimensions, with a list of a number of different possibilities, and we starred the high-value options, or the ones we want to move forward with. Okay? So think of those starred items as the threads. You're pulling out the threads, and you're going to start assembling the story just based on that additional information that we have so far. So let's see what our story looks like when we start adding that information. So first, it's no longer a concert going or any concert goer. It's a superfan concert goer. And they're not all actions, right? They need to search for concert-related dining discounts, okay? So that they can enhance their concert experience. Okay? And then, of course, the other piece is we have the control, right, or the rules. So only members can search for dining discounts, and only active dining discounts can be searched. Okay? You will notice that we have color coding here. We do that on purpose. Each one of our dimensions has a unique image and a unique color that's associated with it. And you also notice that the story, as we get more information, is color-coded, and it lets you sort of pick out, okay, do I have the user, the control? Did we talk about the data? What about the actions, et cetera? So that's why we use sort of the color coding. And the next one, of course, we've included the images. Okay? So does this look a little bit like you have a little bit more information, looks a little bit more ready than the story we had originally? Yes? No? Maybe? A little bit better? Okay. So I'm going to pause here for a moment in terms of the dimensions. So remember we talked about the structured conversation, and there's really 3 key pieces. You explore, so we did that. We talked about the different, here we use the dimensions. We had the product owner evaluate, come up with a subset. Those subset items are starred. Okay? But now the third piece of it is to confirm. So we want to confirm that we have a shared understanding. Now, there are a lot of different ways that you can confirm stories. We're going to go through a couple of them. We're not going to do a deep dive here, but it's just different techniques to get you thinking. Okay? I'm not saying you have to do it this way. We found that this is actually beneficial in terms of getting a shared understanding. So it's very powerful to think about beyond stories and think about sort of scenarios, examples, and tests. And a scenario is an instance of use. So for example, we're searching for dining discounts. A scenario might be, well, we found a dining discount. Another scenario might be, well, there aren't any available for our particular area or for this particular concert. Okay? We then take those scenarios and we derive examples. So examples are those scenarios, but we actually have like real data so that we can use those examples and create or build tests. So we actually have information that eventually become the tests that we're going to use, and sort of we can use as acceptance criteria, where the test really is the concrete, clear, unambiguous acceptance criteria. Okay? Okay? Now, you can also take the opposite approach. Some folks like to take bottom up. So you can start with the test and work your way backwards to examples and eventually scenarios, and potentially even derive other stories from that. Okay? So I'm not prescribing one way or another. It's just this is a way that you can confirm the stories. Now let's look at our example. So we're superfan concert goer. We're looking at a number of different scenarios. I already mentioned 2. Here's a few more. These ones revolve around how you can do your search. Okay, search by nearby restaurant, by particular cuisine, etc. Okay. Confirming with tests. So this one, I'm not sure how many of you have heard of this before, but one of the techniques that we talk about is given when then, which is a technique that comes from the behavior-driven development community. Has anyone heard of given when then, using that to confirm tests? So some folks have. How many of you actually use that? Are you using it? Okay, how are you finding when you use it? Like, are you finding that it's a little bit more concrete? And yeah, okay. So that's one of the benefits, is it becomes a little bit more concrete. So let me explain that to you for those who may not be familiar with it. By the way, the one thing I should mention is the sample format of given when then is generic. Okay, so this is a generic format. Depending on the tools that you use or the particular way the technique is interpreted, it might not look exactly like this. We're just trying to convey sort of the essence of given when then. Okay? So you start off with a story and a particular scenario, and then you outline the context of the system. So given is about what's the context of the system, what are the preconditions, what's the data, the information that we're going to need. Okay? Then you actually outline what's going to be tested. So that's the when piece. And typically, it's the action, so the things that you're going to be testing. And the then part is the result. So what's the expected outcome? Okay, what are you expecting to achieve, observe, with this particular story and scenario, whatever it is that you happen to be testing. Now, you will notice, you will notice that we've color-coded all of these. So these all link back to a particular dimension. So you almost don't even have to think about it that much. If you have the information, you can start filling it in. So there's a way you can link this particular technique back to the different dimensions when you're having your structured conversation. Okay. So let's see what this looks like for our example. So here's the story again. As a superfan concert goer, I want to search for dining discounts so I can enhance my concert experience. And the scenario that we want to talk about is that the discount has been found. Okay. So I'll give you a moment just to have a quick look or quick read of the given section. So for those of you at the back who can't see it as well, so in here we've outlined that the member who's actually doing the search, they exist, and here's a bunch of data related to the different restaurants, their dining discounts, and whether or not their dining discounts are active or canceled, okay, or inactive. Okay. The next piece, the when, is what is it that we're going to test, or what are we trying to confirm? Right? And in here, it's the search. We're trying to confirm search. So based on the information that you see here, what do you think the outcome is going to be, the observable outcome? What's the then piece? Any thoughts? Don't forget the business rule. What should the outcome be? We're looking for dining discounts, only active discounts. What should be the output? Good, excellent. Okay. So lazy goat and cavies will be the ones that come up. Okay. So again, it's just another way of confirming, are we on the same page in terms of the rules, the scenarios, the information that we need. Okay. So it is a good way to confirm the shared understanding, and of course use them eventually to do your testing. All right, so we have 3 more dimensions to go. So the next one is the environment. So the environment is about the physical properties and the technology platforms that the product must conform to. Okay, so lots of decisions there. Okay. And some of you asked them early on. Right? What are the platforms? How are we going to download it? Email, mobile, etc. So the product owner with the team, they come up with a list of options. So for those of you in the back, it's basically from Facebook all the way through to Apple Watch, so iOS, Chrome, Safari, etc., Android. They evaluate their options, and they identify that the 2 that they want to focus on for this next cycle is iOS and Chrome. 2 more to go. So now the interface. Remember, the interface is how the users, systems, and devices connect with the product. Now, in the interface dimension, you can use a context diagram to help the team visualize. You don't have to, but it is a good one we found to be quite helpful. And remember, what we're looking at in this particular dimension with regards to the interface is not the entire system. It really is just about the dining aspect of it, the dining privileges or initiative that we're focused on. That's why you don't see all the pieces of the system, existing system on here. Okay? And it's harder to read for those at the back, but the 4 items we're focused on is search, so entering in some search criteria, the result, and also getting the coupon, selecting the coupon and getting it back. Now, one thing I should mention, in practice, you'd go a little bit deeper because you also need to now start asking questions around, well, what about how do we get the coupon? Is it going to be on a mobile phone? Can we send it via email? Like, how do we actually get the coupon to them? That's just not represented here. But in reality, in practice, there would be more questions to ask, and you would continue to explore and evaluate those options. Here, we're just sort of looking at the key ones in terms of searching for and getting the coupon. Okay. Again, add them to our options board and star them. Okay. And again, if you're struggling with the word options board, use discovery wall. And the last one is our quality attributes. These are the ones that often we forget or we find out kind of late. We forget to ask these questions around scalability and performance, maintainability, security, all these things. That often, if you're on the business side or working with stakeholders, may not necessarily be top of mind. And the better that you can understand this early on, the more ready your stories are, and you won't get stuck halfway through that we can't fix this, we can't really get to done, we need to move these stories out. Okay. So we come up with a list, availability, usability, performance, et cetera, and the decision is made that availability is the high value option. Okay. So here are all these dimensions, we've explored that. It doesn't really take that long in terms of the example that we've used. And then actually in reality, that image of the team that I showed you, after an hour and a half, like I said, they had a lot done. So it isn't just that it's going to take a long time to do. It's actually quite quick in order to go through and get to this shared understanding. So we're going to add 3 more, our remaining. Add them to our stories. Right? And this is the approach that we would use as a team moving forward. So now what does that mean for the story? Okay, so let's add in the 3 more non-functional dimensions to get a more complete understanding. So the the environment, the interface, and the quality attribute. Okay, a little bit more tighter, right? A lot more readier than what we started off with at the beginning. Okay, shared understanding. Would this make sense to anyone reading it? Yes, a stakeholder may not know what some of these things mean, but I would say for the most part, the language that's being used, it makes it much easier for us to get on the same page and make sure we understand the story in such a way that we're ready for development and we will get to done, and that end product will be the right done product chunk. Okay, so just a quick summary. Let me do quick. Okay, so we're on track here. So quick summary. We've sort of had more of a shared understanding, and the shared understanding I want you to think of as a more complete or whole story. We used the 7 product dimensions to explore and evaluate the story. We looked at scenarios, examples, and tests to confirm our understanding to get us closer. We use different visualization techniques or analysis models to visualize, to help us understand while we're exploring, evaluating, and also potentially to confirm our story, to get them to ready. And then, of course, all of this together is your enabling specification. What's key here is that you don't necessarily have to do all of this. It's you pick and choose what makes sense to you in the context of what assets you need to retain. So if it's something that's highly complex, like you might need more visualization techniques than something that's maybe an enhancement and quite easy to get written down, okay, in the story format, including the acceptance criteria, but still with this approach of going through the different dimensions. Okay. So now the story that example we just went through for Concerts for Me, that's now in ready state. Okay. And when stories are ready, it makes it easier for you to allocate them. So you allocate them in a particular release or you allocate them particular sprint, right? Which in essence is the core of planning. So we've gotten a story ready and now we can allocate it, right? And we're not going to have as much I'd say, confusion around what is it that we're allocating and why, and are we going to actually get to done. Okay. So it makes it easier to allocate the stories and hopefully get them done, or get the right things done. So let's quickly go through, why does this even matter? What are some of the benefits of getting ready? So first of all, you optimize collaboration. Right? So instead of sitting there and doing a brain dump of every possible user story for every single persona that we identified at the beginning, it allowed us to focus our attention on what do we think is of high value, in this case the super van. And when we went through each dimension, it was always about what are we going to star? What's our high value option? Because that's where we need to focus our attention. Okay? Not that sitting down and brainstorming tons of user stories is bad. It's just that it's not really just about writing user stories. It's about making sure we're building the high value items and getting to done. And so you focus your attention on high value to get your stories ready. Okay. So the other thing is too, is it prevents waste. So at the beginning when I said you have traveling stories, you might get wrong estimates, you might potentially build the wrong product. So it is a way of minimizing this. So getting your stories ready, using the structured conversation dimensions is a way to prevent waste. It also enables smoother flow within the teams. So halfway through, you don't get stuck and realize, hey, we missed all these questions and the story really isn't ready. So in addition to traveling stories, now we have to go back and forth and potentially might be disruptive to our velocity. It can also increase your velocity. This statement here is based on some research that's been done by Jeff Sutherland. Actually, at the bottom here, I have reference to a study, to an article or white paper that's been written about some studies that he's been doing around how you get stories ready and get ready for development and how that actually increases your velocity. So if you are interested, I'll include it as part of the package so you can look up the white paper. And then the last piece, of course, is enabling you to get to done. So the more important reason is it's not just about, like I said, writing user stories and exploring the dimensions. It really is about what do we need to get us to done, because when we finish, we want to make sure we're not building the wrong products. We want to get to the right done product chunk. Now, a couple of quick things. What we focused on was getting your stories ready. But there is one thing I want to mention. There are different types of ready. So I'm going to quickly go through that, what we mean by ready for planning. So this beautiful, wonderful box or package or product up in the cloud there, that's a bit fuzzy. The reason it's fuzzy is because that's sort of what our potential product might be, sort of all our hopes and dreams of what we think the product is going to evolve into. And as we sort of get these big product chunks and we start refining them into smaller chunks, we then have to get ready for release. Okay? So there is such a thing as a definition of ready at the release level, and I'll show you some examples in a moment. Okay? And as you've done that and you refine, you try to get to ready, and the next ready for planning is the sprint. Okay? So there are two types of getting ready for planning. One is at the release level, one is at the sprint, and there you come up with different definitions for each one of those. We have some samples that we've used with teams in the past that actually other teams have just come up with on their own. So there's some for release planning, some for sprint planning. And similar to definition of done, you come up with the definition of ready for your sprint, what that looks like, and ready for the release, what that looks like. So it isn't like you're crossing your fingers and think, okay, we've got the right stories, we think we're good, and then 2 weeks later you're wondering, something went wrong. So it really is about coming up with, just like definition of done, you come up with a definition of ready. Okay? And again, this varies based on your team, based on your product, the level of complexity, your organization, et cetera. But this is a good starting point. So I do invite you to think about, are there ways to come up with a team's definition of ready to make sure that your planning gets you to the right level of done or gets you to the right product. Now, we've done the ready for planning. Ready for development, we take the stories that we've identified out of our sprint, and now we actually need to build something. And preferably, we build the right product eventually, get to the right product. So ready for development, how many of you have a definition for ready for development? I know some of you have heard of ready, but not very many of you have put it up for just ready for planning. Anyone? Okay, so here are some examples of what criteria would look like for definition of ready for development. And what you'll notice here is there's 3 categories. So I'm oversimplifying here, but in its simplest form is the story valuable, is it actionable, or is it feasible? Okay, so when you're getting ready for development, here's some criteria that you can start to help you with your definition. Okay? Have you looked at the 7 product dimensions? Does everyone know what the value is that you're using as your slicing mechanism? Is the acceptance criteria clear? Do we have the necessary skills? Is the story estimated? Preferably estimated well because the stories are ready, they're concrete, they're clear, they're unambiguous. We also reference on here a video that Jeff Sutherland has done called Ready, Ready. I'm not sure if any of you have done it, but there are additional ideas in that video for criteria for definition of ready for development, if you want to get more information on that. I know a lot of folks here are more here about the stories, but in case we want to get some ideas about making sure your stories get better or get ready for the development folks to make their lives easier, that video is pretty good. Okay? So we've gotten ready for release, ready for the sprint, ready for development, and then this is going to get us to a done product. Okay. And of course, most of you have, in all likelihood, a definition of done. How many folks have a definition of done within their teams? More of you. Okay. What are some examples that folks have? Shout out some criteria. This is the most common one, right? Someone can actually use it. Good. What does that look like? How do you know? How do you know if somebody can? Okay, released and working. Good. Excellent. Good. Yeah, very good. Good. So the feedback here was that you can actually use it in production. It's not in staging. People have access. They can play. They can actually use it, fulfill whatever it is that they needed to. What other examples do folks have? Any other? That's it? We've got 2. Yes, go ahead. Good. Excellent. Excellent. Can you say it a little bit louder?
Yeah, cannot reduce the current test coverage percentage for the code base.
Good. So can't reduce, cannot reduce test coverage for the current code base. Excellent. Good. Okay. So here are some more examples. The product owner accepts it, kind of a no-brainer, but sometimes we don't really realize that that should be a key factor, right, into understanding what done is. The story or the feature could be delivered to the customer. So it's a great example over here. Okay. And you have hopefully identified the done as part of planning. Now, how many of you have a standard definition of done that you use that you don't really change? Okay. Does anyone adapt it based on the release or the road or whatever's on your roadmap, depending on what the key level of complexity? Okay, so everyone's pretty much using the same standard one. So for those of you who may not have one or are curious, again, this is a good starting point, and there are definitely some additional things you can absolutely look up and probably you have at work, okay? Or talk to your development teams. Okay. So any questions before I go? This is a very quiet group. Is it because it's the end of the day? How are we doing? Are we doing okay? We're okay? Okay, good, good. Any questions before we start wrapping up? Yes, go ahead.
The pushback that is very common is going through all those,
Dimensions.
Dimensions and whatnot is a lot of heavy lifting, and the point of agile is getting working software as quickly as possible. Nothing has to be perfect before
Yeah.
it's a
Yes.
development team.
Yes.
So a lot of the pushback is that why can't we just start building it and figure out the loopholes? So how have you dealt with that? Because that's quite common.
Yeah. So what we have found is the perception of heavy lifting it clouds people's judgment rather than just going in a room, spending half an hour, and coming up with whatever that you need to come up with for the release and those sprints and getting the stories ready in there. So what we have found is until you actually get folks up on a wall, book an hour, right, as part of the iteration or sprint planning, and that is the approach you take with people being up and just talking about, okay, which user, what's most important right now around action. It requires heavy facilitation for sure. Like you need a good facilitator, but the way is around it is we get teams to do it. And then they recognize that it's actually not a lot of work. So if you look at the examples that we went through, I mean, we're searching and we're looking for discounts. And yes, this is part of a presentation, and I went through maybe quicker than if we were working in a group. But if you think about it, the items that we came up with, they weren't overly complicated, right? Like it's not like you're sitting down and spending 3 weeks going through those dimensions. You're going through them quickly, right? So it really is this sort of, you're spending 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and you're moving on. But if you don't understand how to facilitate that, or even, so for example, where we find their issues is people who are not comfortable with data. They get a little bit hung up, or like, well, I need a data architect, I need some technical person to help me understand what's in the database. And it's like, no, it's not really about that. It's what information do you need to help you with searching and downloading, or searching and getting the discount so that you can use it. So it's really more about the questioning and quickly going through them. Like, it isn't, that photo that I showed you was an hour and a half, and in an hour and a half they had a full release, the sprints within the release, and the first 3 sprints were, the user stories were clearly articulated. So part of it is actually trying it rather than just thinking, okay, I'm going to talk about the user and exhaust it. Right? What I have found is the perception is, well, I have to exhaust each one of these, and it's not. As soon as you know which the high value is, you're done. Move on to the next one and start talking about it in the context of whatever you just started. Does that make sense a bit? Yeah. So part of it is experimenting with it, and again, you don't have to write all of it down, right? Like, if you have less complex, you can almost do it. Ask the questions. Okay, who are our users? Well, what do we want them to do? Okay, well, based on what we want them to do, what kind of information do we need to make sure that they know how to do it? Well, we need the discounts. We need to know the names of the restaurants. That's about it. Okay, how do we want to deliver to them? Well, maybe the easiest one to start off with is sending something to their phone. Right? Like, even if you just think about the questions that I'm asking, like you don't take 3 months to come to those conclusions. It's really about, okay, what is of the highest value and focusing on them. So it's moving quickly through them. It's not, let's do an exhaustive deep dive. It's across. Does that make sense? Okay. Sorry, I saw another question. Yeah.
Question about the classification of information also.
Yeah.
We just got one story and we got quite a few items under each section. So if you have a lot of user stories and it's all mixed, how do you know that this particular belongs to that? And like, how do you map between them?
For the dimensions.
Yeah.
Like, if you've split the stories up, for example, where the dimensions are split up across user stories and together they give you a complete picture.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
when you look at the whole, how do you know what this one relates to that?
Yeah. So the really interesting thing about this approach, so let me see if I have, okay, well, it's okay, it's too far back. So it's not about sitting down and writing a bunch of user stories and figuring out how they all relate together. It's actually, you notice we did the 4 product dimensions. We had one story. As a concert going, I want to get the concert goer, I want to get discounts, etc. We didn't sit there and write a bunch of stories out after that. We explored those different dimensions, and once we understood, okay, what is it that we want to do? Let's take all these star items. Now I'm going to write my story based on the information I've just starred. So it's not like you have to write a lot of the stories up front and figure out what did you miss. It's more the, okay, what did we talk about? Okay, let's assemble, let's pull this information like threads, and now let's write the story. Right? So it's almost like you're not writing the stories until you actually have a relatively good idea. Now, I don't want you to confuse that with, I have to do all the analysis and then I write my stories, because you still have the product chunks and you refine them. Okay? And you can layer in the dimensions as you need more information. If you have a bunch, okay, so let me pause there. Does that make sense so far? Okay. If you already have a bunch of stories that you've done, right, I don't recommend now going back and saying, okay, let's start rewriting everything. You have a story, you can even take like just colored highlighters. Right? A blue one, a green one for action, a yellow one for users. Look at your stories. Use that highlighter just to highlight which one is about the user, which one is about the action, which one is about the data. And if you notice that the only two, which 2 do we normally see in a user story? As a user, I want to do X, Y, Z because of 1, 2, 3. What are the dimensions we are in every single user story based on that format? User, good, and action, right? So those you know are going to be there, and if those are the only 2 you've got there, you know that we haven't talked about all these other things that make us get the story tighter or ready, what we call ready, but really it's tighter, and it's by using the dimensions in order to make it a little bit tighter. So it's a good way, not starting from scratch, but if you have stories, just use highlighters of different colors and say, okay, which ones are missing, and maybe see if you when to add that information. Okay? And you don't have to add all of the information up front. You can layer it in. Lightweight at the beginning, layer it in as you get closer. Think still just in time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but
Yeah.
bullet wall is like a living wall for the whole project, or is it something that you just temporarily use to come up with?
You can make you can make it as a living wall, because the things that you've come, so if you think about the options board that we had, hold on a sec, let me just pull it up here. Give me 1 second. There we go. So if you think of this options board that we had up here, right? And you think, pretend this is all on a wall, and so they're on Post-it notes, and we put a bunch of stars next to the high value ones, right? They're up on the wall. So the starred things are the things we're going to deal with the next cycle. But guess what? They're up on the wall. Maybe the cycle after that, these other pieces are what we want to look at. So you just go and you start, and then you can write your next story, but more robust because you have this information already up on the wall. So we treat it like a living, like a discovery wall, and it's sort of ongoing. Easier to do if you're co-located and you have your own room, I'll be honest. If you're not, then you need tools, right? Especially if you're distributed, you need some sort of tool to be able to capture this. But you can do both. Like if you need it as part of a kickoff, or if the team is struggling. So for example, if the team is delivered and they keep delivering the wrong product, like you need to probably take a step back. Or if you have a lot of traveling stories, that's why I talked about those indicators at the beginning. If you have these, they're like red flags. So maybe that's an opportunity to try this structured approach, or using the structured conversation. Does that help? Yeah, good. Okay, so yes.
How do you make sure that the iris work items are at the top of the list?
In terms of the prioritization? Yeah. So there is a natural, I don't know if natural is the right word, but there's this natural inclination that whatever we flag as high value, that should be at the top, right? Which may or may not be risky, right? And one of the approaches you might take, especially if it's something really complex or high risky or something you've never done at the organization, you want to do that first, right? Risk is just another criteria that you use in terms of the prioritization. And that might be flagged as high value. So if our goal, or if the thing, let's say the goal for the next release is we need to work through anything that's risky, I'm oversimplifying here, of course, then those would be the things that you would focus on. Those would be where the stars are. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah, and then you break them down using the dimensions. Good, thank you. Yes?
I just want to clarify one thing.
Sure.
You mentioned about ready for sprint and ready for
Yeah.
development.
Yeah.
In ready for development, you said actionable item. One of the actionable item is that they should have all 7 components to it. So I would like to clarify that the story is ready only after all the 7 components, or maybe portion of these 7 components are explored and discussed about, right? So all these planning of 7 components is done in pre-planning, not in planning.
So let me clarify. When we see the 7 product dimensions, there might be stories that you've explored a dimension and it's not relevant. But you've at least said, okay, does this make sense now? Do we have any data? Is there going to be anything related to data? Well, no. We're working, everything exists, the data exists, we're not making any changes to the states, no new fields, tables, etc. So you've explored it, is in or out, impact or not? No, okay. So it's not that that story has data components, you've explored it, you've ruled it out, now we're going to move forward.
My question is that whether it is 7 or 5 or 3 depends on the
Yep.
story.
Yep.
But collecting this information for 7 components, is that done in pre-planning, or that should be done part of the sprint planning?
You do it throughout. So it doesn't matter on what the planning horizon is, right? So it could be now view, remember I said sprint, or preview, which is release, or big view, which is the roadmap. What the difference is the level of granularity, right? So if you're doing, let's say at the release planning, and let's say we're talking about concerts for me. Well, at the release planning, it's okay. Well, we're looking at the at the bigger view, and not the bigger view, the preview, the release view. So search capabilities. At the now view, it's going to be search by, let's say, city, or search by cuisine, right? So it's a much more tighter. It's finer grained, right? So you can still, so the actions, I explored the action. The preview, it's the bigger piece, which is searching. At the now view, or the sprint view, or the iteration view, it's about, well, we're going to be able to search by cuisine or search by local restaurant owner, for example. Do you see what I mean? So it's the level of granularity and the level of details. You don't need all the details about local cuisine, et cetera, at the preview level. Does that make sense?
As long as what components are involved in that story, right?
Yes, that you've at least at a high level identified, okay, check, or no, and maybe a question mark, we need to do a deeper dive a little bit later. Okay. The piece where I really talked about looking at the 7 dimensions in a bit more depth is about getting your stories ready. So your stories so that they're ready. So in development, you're not getting these traveling stories or you can't estimate or all the estimates are all over the place because we completely missed all these questions about the environment, et cetera. Does that make sense? Okay. I think I only have a couple minutes, so 2 minutes, I think, because it's just 3:30. So let me just wrap up. We're at the end anyways, and then I do want to do the draw. So ready and done, hopefully. I know all of you put your hands up for done. Hopefully I've inspired you to think about, hey, do we need a definition of ready for our planning, for development, but more importantly, looking at a different way to get a shared understanding of your user stories to get them ready so you end up delivering the right product or the done product. Okay. Good, excellent, thank you. So before we go, I do want to do the draw. We don't have to record this part, by the way. We're good to go. There is on here, just if you are interested in looking at the visuals that we have or the option boards, if you want to practice or experiment with setting up a discovery board using the options, you can go to the discovertodeliver.com site, and it's /resource.php. Again, we're gonna put out the deck as well through TAC conference, so at least this way you can have access to this. Okay. So for those of you who can't see, it's discovertodeliver.com /resource.php.